Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And today we're going to cover a few topics, but to begin with, I wanted to go over the test questions and tell you something of how I would have approached these questions. Uh, when it'll be useful, I think, because when it comes time for the final exam, although you won't have the same questions, some of the same ground will be covered because the final will cover the whole semester. So I think it'd be useful to go through these questions one by one and let you know how I would answer it. I will hopefully be giving you back your grades by the next class, and we'll be working on that and finishing that in the coming week. So let's begin with the first question. And the first question was, Halliday quotes another scholar who wrote that Tennyson's poetic imagination can sometimes be examined in terms of his grammar. Referring to the poetry of Edwin Tumbu, discussed in class, show how Edwin Tumbu's poetic imagination can be discovered from looking at his use of grammar. So, taking a look at this, it's not for you to, it wasn't necessary for you at all to be, and the question wasn't asking you to go back over Halliday's discussion of Tennyson's In Memoriam. The only aspect that I was really interested in was this quote that Halliday uses, and which he mentions comes from, as he puts it, a little paper by Walker Gibson. I submit, this is Walker Gibson writing, then, that Tennyson's poetic imagination can sometimes be examined in terms of his grammar. So the question was, what does that mean? And if we apply that to the poetry that we have been looking at and paying attention to, poetry of Edwin Tumbu, how does that sort of translate into, and how does an approach looking at the grammar help us have a better understanding of what the poet is telling us? In looking at, for example, that first poem, Gods Can Die, the grammar takes us in a particular direction. It takes us in this direction repeatedly, using what will be quite symmetrical. It's pairing items, it's comparing. There is a symmetry, there is a duality. And it's repeated lexically, major versus minor, private, public, generous, mean, and so on. So the poet, using the grammar, looking at his grammar, we see the direction that the poet is taking us in terms of how to see this sort of Halliday likes to talk about the personality of a text. And so what is the personality here? The personality that we're looking at is one that is symmetrical. It is dual. Now, there are other ways in which, not just lexically, but there are other ways also that this idea of symmetry comes across, and that is through what we've described as parataxis. Yet some of these terms you do need to know, like what is parataxis? The joining of two more or less grammatical elements that are of equal grammatical standing. They are equal, there's a balance. And this can be apposition, two nouns side by side that mean the same thing. The opposition, two nouns that are meaning something different. Addition, like when you use and. Negation, like when you use but. Alternation, or. Now, we have a number of other illustrations, undo versus bind, evenings versus days, but the whole point of this was, as we said, to build up an idea, a personality of the text that is reflecting this sort of sense that there is two sides. There is this balance. But then what the poet does is, having established this balance, having established this duality, this symmetry, goes on to break it. Break it by adding an undercurrent of confusion, contradiction, breaking the symmetry with something that is a connection that is imbalanced. And where is that? How does that come through in the grammar? What we call hypotaxis. So let's take a look. If you remember, we looked at the various levels of, this was, as we said, this is the poet's craft. And in this case, level by level of what would be paratactically joined grammatical elements. Undo, keep, two realities, one for this, one for that, the powers that be, the really powerful. That last one, the powers that be, the really powerful, that is what we mean by an appositive, all right? So, but then that parataxis, that symmetry is broken where the poet is trying to make a point. And here it's done through no longer using parataxis, but instead hypotaxis. But after a bit of duty that makes them fester with intentions, they play the major figure to old friends. So we have that dependent clause that makes them fester with intentions. This basically a relative clause. And that relative clause then is dependent. It is we called it the beta clause. It is not independent. It's not the main clause like they play the major figure to old friends. That's the main clause, the alpha clause. And so there is that imbalance. And no longer symmetrical, it's asymmetrical, but it infused then in this poem at certain points what was otherwise the sort of personality, the emphasis on symmetry, the emphasis using parataxis is broken. We see other examples as well. This is repeated throughout the poem. When the poet wants to make a point about his friend, where it isn't what he says is that we are like possessing two sides. And which side of him prevails? That's his point. When he talks about gods, he's saying these humanistic impulses. That's one side of us. And so you have these two sides. And then when there isn't a balance, and when this balance is broken in favor of not the good side, when that happens, gods can die. That's his point. As he says, I believe that ultimately man makes and unmakes his destiny depending on which side of him prevails. So he's putting across a poem where it is emphasizing this idea of two sides, symmetrical, balance. But when that balance is broken, that's when not the good side, not the side with the humanistic impulses, not the goodness in man, but man's other nature comes out. Now, that was one poem. You could have focused on that, looked at that. This is something we've discussed before, Tumbu's David. Now, instead of here making a sort of the background, the parataxis and the symmetry, here the background is the hypotaxis. Very complex clauses joining a number of dependent clauses. You take a look at the example on the screen. They left, taking, had shaved, missing, sat, composing. I mean, you have this three levels where you always have a main clause, and they left, and a dependent clause, taking the spear, whose sharp whistle, just missing him, on and on. It is repeated levels of hypotaxis, complexity, in order to be able to bring to the fore, to be able to bring out the simple pairing, the cruise of water, life. The simplicity stands out against this grammatical complexity. Pain and joy, the simple parataxis, in a poem that is otherwise, whose personality is otherwise full of asymmetry, imbalance, hypotaxis. The poet is using the grammatical resources available to him to be able to create a personality, to be able to create, define the sort of automatic, the default of the text, in order, as we've said, to break it. And the last poem that we're going to look at of Tombu's that we've mentioned before, and this one is ideal, because his whole point being about a poem is something that is timeless, in terms of immortal, in terms of being able to convey meaning to whoever is reading it. So we have a poet reading. This idea that the poem is never really done, it's never really perfect. The use of ing verbs to indicate that ongoing activity. We use this quote from Professor David Butt: mobilizing the habitual patterns, the way we use language, adding ing to a verb to mean something that's ongoing. But now, within the poem, within the confines of this text, within the world of this text, it is used with such intensity and such frequency that it is a non-habitual and extraordinary consistency is created. And the background, the use of the conjunction as. He keeps using this conjunction. What is he expressing? Things are ongoing at the same time. There's a simultaneity to it. It is concurrent. It is incomplete. And then he brings in these use of pronouns, and pronouns, they beg the question, who? Well, surely we know who is we, and we know who is you, but who is she? And so it begs the question. And looking at the who is she, we see define the fact that she is in the finite verb is always in the simple present. She is. Timelessness. All of these ideas, ongoing activity, simultaneity, incompleteness, timelessness, all are gotten across through establishing a pattern, using the grammar. If we want to know what's going on in the poem, it's through the grammar. Well, that was the first question. And so, yes, basically, you needed to go back over and identify what we've been talking about. So the idea is not just to go back and say, well, this poem means this or that poem means that. That's the whole point that we're trying to get away from. Not to just make it sort of an individual, anecdotal, well, this poem could mean this to you, or it could mean that. Instead, to actually go back and dig into and identify and discover from the poet's use of grammar how that poet creates a personality for the text, creates the default, creates the background against which to foreground, against which to give us a particular meaning. The second question, grammatical metaphor. You cannot escape metaphor in looking at language in terms of its ability to be creative and innovative and even inspirational. So we've looked at metaphor, and you're used to the idea of a lexical metaphor, but we introduced the idea of a grammatical metaphor. But then on top of that, we're asking another question, and that was, how can it be described as a kind of de-automatization? Why use grammatical metaphor in the first case? What help does it? We say that it's innovative, but why are we innovating? Whenever you look at the grammar, you're asking yourself, what is its purpose? What is its function? What is its meaning? And so I'm asking you then, use examples from the lectures, illustrate how grammatical metaphor is used to make meaning. First question you had to really come to grips with, though, was de-automatization. What is de-automatization? The point being, it's not just in poetry. It's not just in verbal art. It's not just the idea of foregrounding against a background. There's something else happening. It is that. It is. De-automatization is, yes, what goes on in poetry, but it's more than that. It's also what's going on in the language of science. It is basically describing what it means to create a metaphor. It is a kind of de-automatization. Halliday puts it this way: it's not, what is in question is not simply prominence. It's not just simply the foreground. It's not just simply being able to stand out against something. Rather, what is really going on is the partial freeing of the lower level systems from the control of the semantics, so they become domains of choice in their own right. You are looking at it as though you have meaning, semantics, and you have the grammar, the lexicogrammar, the wording. They're connected, and as though the grammar is under the control of the semantics. In other words, meaning, in the way that we're looking at language, meaning has the priority. What language is about is meaning. The forms of language are there to produce the meaning. They serve a purpose. That's all. And so you have the semantics. It has sort of this control over the grammar, this connection. But what you're doing is you're saying, let's free the grammar from the semantics. We liberate it from it. It's not under the control anymore. To de-automatize means to try to interpret the grammar in terms that go beyond its direct realizational function. And so the direct realizational function is things are nouns. Processes are verbs. That's it. That's the semantics in control of the grammar. And so what Halliday is saying, free this connection. Allow it to be decoupled and recouple it then in a different way, how you choose to. And so in this case, instead of things being nouns and qualities being adjectives and processes being verbs, instead of the congruent, the straightforward, the default, grammatical metaphor means that we are able to recouple it in a completely different way. This is indeed an ability to innovate in language. It is ability to And why is it metaphorical? Because what we're saying is that just like when you say that the example I've always been giving you, Tim is a rock, he takes on the qualities of rockness, we've said that the grammatical categories themselves have a meaning. What is the meaning of noun? It's a thing. It's concrete. It has substance. It takes on the qualities of thingness. And that's what's metaphorical about it. The verb, a process, takes on the qualities of nounness. We saw this and we illustrated this with that speech from Donald Jung. You remember it well. We looked at it and realized that reminder. What is a reminder? It is something. We have a choice. It reminds us, but instead, it is a reminder. It is something. It exists. It has substance. It takes the verb to remind and gives it that quality of nounness. It becomes something. Grammatical metaphor is a means to innovate using the grammar, not just the meaning of words, but the meaning of grammatical categories. Now, the question was why? Why was this introduced into the language of science? And Halliday did his study of scientific discourse going back hundreds of years and looking at how the grammar has been changing and asking the question, why is the grammar changing? Halliday got interested in this because he was looking at the fact that students in secondary school were having difficulty reading scientific textbooks. What was it that was challenging? Why? What was the way of writing, the way of speaking in the language of science? What was there about it that's different than what that student would have been encountering up until that point in their study? And what they were encountering was the use of metaphor, the use of grammatical metaphor. This idea of turning verbs, actions, into nouns. Scientists, as Halliday points out, made use of pre-existing resources. They created a discourse, and how that discourse progressed from as it proceeded was through steps, each building on what has gone before. And this is so well illustrated in this example that I've been giving you. The solvent tends to be drawn through the membrane into the solution, thus diluting it. Now, as we're moving forward through the text, as we proceed on to the next sentence, we now capture what was there as a happening. We now capture it as a something which then can be discussed with reference to something else. It's a case of sort of repackaging. As we progress through, it is a way for scientific discourse to progress. You talk about what happened, but then you repackage it in a way so that now you can refer to it as you proceed through the text. Movement of the solvent across the membrane. Halliday, he says this nominalizing grammar gave scientists enormous power. How? Because you froze the world. You put it into a sense of nounness. You now put it into, you've frozen it as something. The world stands still. You can describe it. You can talk about it. You can create new virtual realities. It is taking the clausal way, using verbs, conjunctions, and instead turning those verbs into nouns, connecting up then these nouns through verbs that show that relationship that previously was established through conjunctions. A shift. The shifting is taking place. It isn't just nouns. It isn't just taking verbs and turning them into nouns. There's more going on than that. It is a structural configuration is completely also shifting. So whereas you had, in this case, when you talked about, you had more than one clause, you had a complex clause, we could say. You had "they educated girls," and then joined by a conjunction with another clause. You now shifted to one single clause. The education of girls preceded the acquisition of the vote by a woman. You have two nouns and a verb. You have one clause. You have, do you notice something happening? What you see in the language of science is that the clauses are being simplified. Instead of two clauses joined by a conjunction, you turn it into one clause. So clausally, it becomes simple. Then where's the complexity? The complexity is that you now put so much information into the noun, the nominal group, the noun phrase. That now captures so much more in that, so that what you end up with is a single clause, a single sentence that is lexically dense. It becomes grammatically, clausally simple, lexically dense. There's more words, there's more content words within each clause, because that information has all been repackaged into the nominal group. And this grammatical drift is what we see in terms of these shifts have become so frequent. They have become so much the way we speak. It has taken on this novel intensity. It has become the way that writers in English write. In an academic context, it need not be, it's not just biology, it's not just mathematics, not just engineering. It is across the university, across academic discourse. And then that now becomes the case when you go to some government bureaucracy and receive something from this government agency. It will be also written in the same way. It has sort of permeated the way that we write. And this change has been coming about in the language. These shifts that we see occurring within an example, they become so intense, so frequent, that they become the way we speak. It becomes a dedicated semiotic system. It becomes a register. It becomes the way of speaking and writing science. What has happened? Scientific discourses have moved in the direction of things. This is the drift. Things have been foregrounded at the expense of qualities, processes, and relations. This is the impact. The purpose? To make the world stand still, yeah. And in the process, though, what it has done is evolve into not just our language, but our way of thinking, where we see the world in terms of not of actions, not of happenings, but of some things. Question 3. Out of this coordination between the aesthetic, the artist's craft, and the functional, the artist's message, comes our myth, story-making potential to create extended metaphors with the power to move people, to heal. Give examples from lectures to support the above statement. Well, you begin to see that the three questions that I've been asking you, the first question was focusing more on the kind of metaphor-making potential that there exists in verbal art, that exists through foregrounding. What we see in the second question was looking at metaphor here more in the sense of grammatical metaphor. Now in this question, what we're coming at and we're looking at, we're saying that out of this ability to create extended metaphors, out of this ability in verbal art, the ability to be inspirational. The course is art, invention, and inspiration. Even a kind of almost healing power. Now, I hope you don't think I'm exaggerating, but because I really believe that is the case. What you're looking at in terms of what is happening in language is not just the ability to be innovative in the language of science. And it's not even just purely aesthetic, like making beautiful poetry. There is another element to it as well. There is the ability to inspire, to heal. I ask you to give examples to support this statement. You remember that Hassan says this. She says there's a sociotherapeutic function in the study of literature. As she puts it, to make the readers more human than they were before they came to read that literature, to change people's perspective on things. What she's saying is that there is a function, there is a purpose behind the art. You go back to the question, it's saying that there is a coordination between the aesthetic, the craft, and the functional, the message.
Well, I was always interested in literature, and up to the time that I did my own study, postgrad study at Edinburgh, up to that time, in fact, I went into that study because I was convinced of the therapeutic, sociotherapeutic function of the study of literature. That literature, the teaching of literature could be such that it could make the readers more human than they are before they came to read that literature, you know. So I always felt that you could really change people's perspective on things by teaching literature properly.
Okay, thank you for responding. I asked you during the video whether you could hear the sound. I am plugged in and I don't see why I'm not getting the sound out of my earphone. Doesn't seem to be, for some reason, doesn't seem to be working. So I was a bit worried maybe whether you were hearing it. I'm glad that thanks for letting me know that you did. All right, so she's saying there's a sociotherapeutic. It is to make people, she puts it, more human, more to change people's perspective on things. Now, how does that come about? Remember, she's saying that in verbal art, there is this idea of articulating a symbol, the symbolic meaning, the metaphor, that there's a deeper meaning within the poem. And that poem is realized through foregrounding, as we just were seeing with respect to the examples from Edwin Tumbu's poetry, taking the way that we use language, using it with a non-habitual consistency, creating a pattern against which to foreground against that pattern. purpose. The purpose is to be able to convey a theme, a motif, being able to put across some hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. It is produced through craft, but there is a function. There is a message. There is a theme about some aspect of the life of social man. And she's saying that the patterns are deployed, taking us in a particular direction. Well, again, we just saw that. We talked about the personality of the text and how this is established through creating that, in the case of Gods Can Die, the duality, the symmetry. Each message is a message by itself, yes, but the totality of the messages. And this is why you call it an extended metaphor, because it isn't just one word. It isn't even just one grammatical category in terms of grammatical metaphor. It is something that you see realized across the text. It is extended. What is extended is choices, a patterning of choices, a consistency of choices. And those choices then, how that theme comes across is the repatterning. She goes on to say the theme becomes accessible by the examination of the meaning of the individual messages, the background. This patterning that you see that extends through the text, be guided by the repatterning of patterns. The repatterning is that foreground. It is that de-automatization. It is breaking that pattern that has been established through the text, creating an extended metaphor. The text itself becomes the metaphor. The choices that are made throughout that text, the character, the personality, however you want to put it, that becomes the basis for the metaphor, articulating some symbolic value. And that symbolic value is the theme, the motif, the idea, the hypothesis that artist wants to put across. And so we looked at this, for example, in Brandon Leake, this winner of America's Got Talent. We looked at the text one of his spoken word performances. We looked at it in terms of the grammar and so forth that is used. And we noticed that it begins with really rather simple clauses up through the first 10 sentences. It's quite simple in terms of the logical structuring, simple clauses or simple pairing, more paratactic. There's rhyme. And however, when it gets to the 13th sentence, where he really comes through with the agony that he felt on the death of his sister, that's where it peaked. It peaked in terms of the number of content words. Why was it lexically dense? It was lexically dense because there were so many clauses that were combined together. There was so much embedding. We talked about the language of science being lexically dense because you have a lot of embedding. You have a lot of clauses that are post-modifying nouns, part of a noun phrase. Well, you see the same in this poem. He comes along as simple, it's paratactic, and then very complex clause, hypotaxis, lexically dense. The contrast is made, and that's where your attention is being drawn. As we looked at the poem, it begins with rhyme, it ends with rhyme. What's the difference then? What's come in the middle? What's come in the middle has been talking about the death of his sister. There's a shift from the active voice where he is in control to the passive voice where he is no longer the initiator, he is the affected. The events are out of his control. We observed a number of contrasts: presence versus the absence of rhyme, simple versus complex clauses, paratactic in the first 12 sentences, hypotactic thereafter, an elevated lexical density in that same, where you notice this hypotaxis. It's lexically dense, it's clausally complex in terms of hypotaxis and embedding. All of this taking place to bring about a message. What was the theme? The theme was basically coming full circle. He comes back to rhyme. He comes back to it, but it is a much more complex world. It is a different outlook on life that he has and loss after having gone through this. The poem reaches out to people. The poem affects people. They respond to it. You remember the judges in that America's Got Talent. It wasn't just impressed with his eloquence, it was moved. Russell Mears, you remember Russell Mears? He's the emeritus professor of psychology at psychiatry at University of Sydney. And he talks about writing poems, and he says it has a healing purpose, a therapeutic function. And he describes the structure of mind as like the structure of a poem. I had discussed this with you before, but I want to go back over it because to me it's one of the most important elements of this course. We're looking at language and art, but it's not just about art. It's not just about invention. It's not just the innovation. It's also the inspiration. Now, where does this ability to be inspirational come from? Where does this ability to have a therapeutic function, a healing purpose come from? Mears says it has to do with the fact that the structure of the mind is like the structure of a poem. How is that so? How is the structure of mind like the structure of a poem?
In the end, it's been useful because I now see the structure of mind as like the structure of a poem.
Okay,
You know,
yeah. Would you say it's a healing prospect for you, writing poetry?
I would say it is, yeah, absolutely. And I became particularly interested in a poet called Wallace Stevens, who's a kind of not very well known poet, but amongst critics, he's regarded as one of the three great poets of the English language in the 20th century. And he basically admitted that writing poetry through his life had a healing purpose. It was a therapeutic function.
Again, keep in mind our question is this: how is the structure of a poem or any instance of verbal art, it doesn't have to be just a poem, how is it like the structure of mind? So what's the structure of mind? We said two modes of thought, two modes of language. The left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere, more what we associate with science, more the practical, reason, logic. The right hemisphere, what we associate with passion, emotion, creativity, art, music, love. Okay. Two sides, two hemispheres, two ways of thinking, two ways of speaking. And what is this? What are these two forms of language? And here I'm quoting from Russell Mears. his book, Borderline Personality Disorder and the Conversational Model. If you remember, it's his manual for how he conducts a psychiatric session in terms of dealing with someone with borderline personality disorder. And he adopts a particular methodology, which he calls the conversational model. What he's pointing out is the fact is that there are these two modes of thinking, these two modes of speaking. And this is well established, all right? It's not just from Mears, this is well established. There is inner speech. There is social speech. The inner speech, you can see the list here, analogical, and I've mentioned this before. On the one hand, we'll deal here first with social speech, the logical. What he writes is this: the language of social engagement is, in a broad sense, logical. It is communicative, and so has a purpose. It is directed toward this purpose of communication and toward objects in the environment. It is linear in a broad and non-technical sense. It has long been known that this kind of language involving propositional speech is dependent upon left hemispheric function. Communicative, purposeful, the language of social engagement. Inner speech, language associated with symbolic play. He quotes Vygotsky, has described it as nonlinear, associative, purposeless. It is the aesthetic. It has a right hemispheric basis. And Mears suggests this non-linear form of language, this inner speech, is necessary for representation and the bringing into being of self. There is a complementarity between the two. What Mears goes on to say is that there is a trajectory, there is a way, there is a direction. And this evolutionary trajectory is towards the ability to construct a story. The prologue, he says, to which is necessarily a proto-language that involves the use of symbols. It is beyond just the ability to make metaphor. It is the ability to make story, a myth. The crucial narrative, he says, which Homo sapiens evolved, gave it an evolutional advantage, was not any kind of story. It has the structure of myth. What is the structure of myth? What is so special about it? It is the coordination of two forms of language and modes of thought. It is the two ways of thinking, the two ways of speaking. It is the right hemisphere, it is the left hemisphere, it is the complementarity between the two, it is the aesthetic, and it is the functional. And that is what there is, and it is the coordination between the two of them that creates this myth-making potential beyond metaphor. The ability to tell a story, to be able to know oneself. This is the point that we're making. And this is then what you see when we talk about there being a message, there is a theme, there is a deeper meaning. It isn't just the aesthetic, it is also the functional. And it is between the coordination of these two that what comes out of it is this myth-making potential in language. What is myth-making? Myth-making draws on the coordination of these two forms of language, these two modes of thought. It is the functional, it is the communicative, it is the purposeful, and it is the aesthetic, the symbolic, the metaphorical. It's both. And it is bringing the two together and the coordination of both together that is the basis of this myth-making. So the question I posed before to you, and that is, where is the art in verbal art? Yes, it's in the mobilization of these habitual patterns of language choice into a non-habitual consistency. It's the foregrounding of a hypothesis about some aspect of social life. It is the coordination of the aesthetic through the deployment of the artist's craft and technique, but it is also the functional, communicating a hypothesis, a message. When you look at what makes it impresses one is not just the aesthetic, it is the meaning that comes through that. Creating an extended metaphor. What is the extended metaphor? The extended metaphor is the myth. Out of this coordination between the aesthetic, the craft, the functional, the message, comes our ability to create extended metaphors with the power to move people and to heal. Remember what I mentioned before to you about Carl Jung, what he said about myth. And this, you'll remember, it was after his breakup with Freud. He felt verge of a breakdown. He had no clear direction in his life. So to find his way out of that chaos in his thinking, he asked himself, what is the myth you are living? I quote from Carl Jung, I found no answer to this question. I had to admit I was not living a myth or even in a myth. So in the most natural way, I took it upon myself to get to know my myth, and I regarded this as the task of tasks. Jung was searching for a myth that would have the effect of a picture of reality. You remember, if you go back and look at the first lecture, remember Mears talks about what is a metaphor, the picture making potential. But here we're saying that it extends beyond just the word or even the clause. It extends across the text. It is an extended metaphor. And the power of this extended metaphor is this ability to not just be creative in terms of language, not just the aesthetic, not just the artist's use of the craft, but what it is that the artist is conveying, the message, the theme, the hypothesis. This then makes the poem a therapeutic exercise. It is an exercise in healing. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, we looked at the way he wrote poetry while he was in prison. You remember, he was put in prison. He had helped Jews to escape Germany. The money that he gave to them was traced back to him. He was arrested. He also was implicated for his association with those that were part of Valkyrie, the attempt to assassinate Hitler. He was in prison. He was executed just before liberation. In prison, he wrote poetry. He was a minister, a Lutheran pastor, and his poetry expresses the pain he felt. One of the poems that we looked at past, you could see he had just become engaged to his fiancée, and he was then put in prison. And it's almost like he's losing the memory. And it's because it's almost as though there is no future. There is no past. Is losing touch with it. There's a dialogue. He himself said about the poem, the dialogue with the past. It is an attempt to hold on to it, above all the fear of losing it. You see, this is his myth. This is his story. Is almost the daily accompaniment of my life here in prison, and sometimes, especially after brief visits, which are always followed by long partings, becomes a theme with variations. We looked at that poem, and saw how throughout the poem there is this agony, there is this angst which comes through in the way the poem is written. It's not so poetic. There isn't there isn't great technique that is used here. It's quite chaotic, but that was the point. And at the very end of the poem, though, like almost in the Psalms, he comes to this point of healing. As he puts it, I stretch out my hands and pray, and I learn something new. That which is past will return to you again. There is a future, will. As your life's most living strain, through thanks and through repentance, will return to you. He is being spoken to from outside. All throughout the poem, it is him addressing you, the past. And now someone is speaking to him. Lay hold. This is speaking to him. Lay hold on God's forgiveness in the past. Pray that he will care for you this day and to the last. The you himself. We looked at David Foster Wallace and his commencement speech. And remember that it's in Time magazine considered to be at the very top of the top 10 commencement speeches. We looked at it. There was throughout the poem this, as Time magazine said, it was almost like the first draft of a suicide note. So where's the healing here? Where's the healing in this? It's not a poem. It's a speech. He was a famous novelist. He, yes, later did commit suicide. So what was the point of what he was saying? If you look at the end, it says here, while it's a macabre read, there's tons that's worthwhile here. The speech crackles with wit and intelligence and offers tricks for escaping the depression to which Wallace ultimately succumbed. But the point that is made is that when he wants to make a point, he precedes it with a very simple clause, very few words, very direct, followed by very, very complex, high lexical density. A lot of clauses, a lot of ideas together. But there is this valley, and then there is this peak. And it is in the peaks that his message is coming across. What was his message? Well, how you think. He himself says this is a standard requirement of U.S. commencement speeches, the deployment of a didactic little parable-ish stories. The story thing turns out to be one of the better, less bullshitty conventions of the genre. But if you're worried that I plan to present myself here as the wise older fish explaining what water is to you younger fish, please don't be. I'm not the wise old fish. A commencement speech is supposed to inspire you. And he's saying, and it's supposed to give advice from one's personal experience. And he's saying, this is neither. And he goes on to say, I know this stuff probably doesn't sound fun and breezy or grandly inspirational the way a commencement speech is supposed to sound. But then he goes on, what it is, as far as I can see, is the capital T truth. With a whole lot of rhetorical niceties stripped away. You are, of course, free to think of it whatever you wish, but please don't just dismiss it as some finger-wagging Dr. Laura sermon. It isn't just he has a message. And the message almost goes against the grain of everything you expect in a commencement speech. The whole text itself is more or less against the default. What is a commencement speech? It's supposed to inspire. It's supposed to give you advice on how to go through in your life and succeed. He's saying it's neither. It is like what Halliday calls an anti-language. It is describing some alternative counter reality. established in contrast to some established norm. There is a norm for what should be a commencement speech. But in this case, he is presenting something which is not like any commencement speech. But notice that what happens to Time magazine, it's at the top. Why? This anti-commencement speech, so contrary to the genre, so contrary to what we expect, so contrary to the default. It presents an alternative against the default, but that's the whole point of the speech. He's saying that we have a default, and our default is basically a self-centeredness about us. That's our default. That's our reality. And basically his whole speech was that there is a freedom in realizing that there is this default and that there is a way to escape it by knowing it, by realizing it, and by seeing beyond it, and by changing the way one thinks. And there is a counter reality. There is something that is different. That is his whole point. The whole point of his speech is basically, the theme of his speech is the need to de-automatize. Need to de-automatize what? The automatic that is our default, that we have a very self-centered way of thinking, and that has to change. The whole text itself is a de-automatization that says we need to de-automatize. We need to realize there is a reality beyond our default self-centeredness. It is caring for others. I don't know if I told you before, why did he commit suicide? He had this novel that was received so well, and he was working on his next novel. He had suffered from depression since his early university days. He was on medication for that depression. It was a chemical imbalance. But then he had difficulty in writing that second novel. It just wasn't coming to him. And he thought maybe it's the medication. He went off the medication. And not long after, he committed suicide. That's his story. But his story was basically one to say to people that when he wrote, his writing, as we can see from what he just was speaking in this commencement speech, was to break out of, to de-automatize. That is, and he is saying the need to de-automatize from out of our way of thinking, from our myth that we are at the center of the universe and everything revolves around us, and change that myth. This is the whole point of language. It is out of the de-automatization, out of the art, there is a message. In his case, it was the need to de-automatize out of one's way of thinking. Well, that's to review basically what we've been, those are the major points that I was hoping you would be looking at in terms of going over these three questions. And we'll be giving you back your, as I said, I'll be giving you back your tests by next week. And as I said, I go through this because to me these are major points for the course, and they'll be, in some ways, these ideas will be revisited on the final. So it's a good idea for you to sort of see it now after having done the test, and in some respects, hopefully see again maybe hopefully with some greater clarity the points that I've been trying to make. There is a third continuous participation task that will be due on the 26th. The question is, do you agree that sometimes the way we use language defeats its intended purpose? In other words, language is meant to accomplish something, but the way we use it, the way we use language defeats its purpose. Now, what I'm going to be talking about when we come back from our break, hopefully will give you some better idea of where I'm wanting you to go with this question. All right? So we'll take a break, and I know I've extended beyond, but I did want to finish that part in the first session. All right, so it's now it's about 5 after 1. So let's come back around 1:15. All right, and we'll carry on. Again, keep this question in mind. Do you agree that sometimes the way we use language defeats its intended purpose? Okay, we'll come back to this and see you in about 10 minutes. All right. Okay, when we left off, I left you with this next continuous participation task. This is the third one. There'll only be one more. And this one I'm giving you on today, week 9. The next one will be in week 11. This will be due on the 26th. All right, so please pay attention to that. You only need to write 180 to 200 words. And do you agree sometimes the way we use language defeats its intended purpose? Okay, so let's talk about it first in the sense and to get some basis on which we're going to be reflecting on this question. And we've been talking a lot about art, invention, inspiration, healing, also positive uses of language, right? Let's for the time look at it from a different angle. When does language not live up to its intended purpose? To do that, we need to consider the fact that language, it doesn't occur in isolation. It occurs in a context of situation. And what does that situation require? What does that situation call for in terms of the way we use language? Now, this notion of register, this linking the context with the text, this is something which is quite not so, you don't hear much about it in modern linguistics, but you do hear it about it in this particular approach of M.A.K. Halliday to linguistics, this systemic functional linguistics. Now, what is register? A register is a variety of language. It's a way we speak that is defined by field, tenor, mode. Meaning this, that how you perceive the situation. Field, tenor, and mode. What we mean by that is field is what are you talking about? Tenor, who are you engaging with? Who are you relating to? And mode, how are you writing or how are you expressing yourself? Is it through speech? Is it through writing? Is it through on social media, through tweeting? Or how is it? Well, the situation, the context, these three aspects, field, what's being talked about, tenor, who is talking to whom, mode, how it's being said. So what, who, and how. Context of situation will activate some choices that we're going to make. And these choices in terms of meaning will be realized by certain choices of wording. On the other side, though, the meaning word choices that are activated by the context in which we're in, the choices that how we're going to express ourselves, the choices of what we want to say, the choices of how we're going to express it. These are activated by the context of situation, but at the same time, they form what we would call a register. It becomes a way of speaking. Think about it like this. There are three domains of human experience. Action, what's going on. Relations, who is acting with whom. Contact, how those who are engaged, who's acting with whom, how they are brought together to facilitate a successful performance. All right, so we have action, relations, contact. Professor Hassan, you remember her from verbal art? She refers to this as action, relation, contact, ARC. She says, examining action, relation, contact from the perspective of language as text. We're interested in how we actually use language, all right? The word text here, I use it a lot too, doesn't just mean a written text, all right? It means any use of language at all. Examining ARC from the perspective of language as text reveals the reach of language in human life. Every instance of context of situation holds in it what language has achieved for the community in past action, what it is doing in the present, and what might be anticipated on that basis in the future. What she's saying is that every instance, if you look at any situation in which you find yourself, what's being called for is how has language been used in the past? And that has sort of that history is the basis for which we form certain expectations. But that is, those expectations are going to be realized in the present and may in fact be sort of indicating what is likely to be in the future, not necessarily, because language changes. Now, this idea of action, relation, contact, there are certain dimensions of context itself. Those are human experience. So out of what is going on, action, there is we'll call it field, what is being talked about. And this corresponds, remember we talked about the meta functions of language, the way we experience the world around us. That is the what. The relations, who is acting with whom. We're going to be referring to that in terms of context of situation as the dimension of tenor. Who is talking to whom? Notice that all of this is about talk, all right? We're looking at language in context of situation defined by what is being talked about, who is talking to whom, corresponds the interpersonal metafunction, and finally the mode, the channel, how that communication takes place, the textual. That we have the three metafunctions, experiential, interpersonal, textual, and we see that corresponding to our understanding of what is the situation, described in terms of field, the what, tenor, the who, the mode, the how. Now, we have said before, we've looked at this and I've given you this statement before. I want you to keep in mind here. In real life, texts carry value. Our use of language is going to be valued. It's going to be responded to. It's going to be considered appropriate, inappropriate. It's going to be considered effective or ineffective. It's going to be judged. And we need to explain the value. We need to explain how it is so assessed in terms of what we know about how we make meaning, about meaning and how meaning is made. All right, so let's address this then. We're trying to meet the challenge of explaining the value of text. Now here, we're not just saying how it makes meaning. We're saying how effective it is. If I'm going to ask the question about does it meet its purpose or does it not, that is its value too. Is it doing what it's supposed to? Meeting the challenge of explaining the value of text in real life. Let's get real, so to speak here. Let's really look at the use of language. And we're going to be able to ask, can we explain the value of a text in terms of what we know about how we make meaning using language? Okay, now I'm going to illustrate this with, in 2019, I was asked to provide linguistic evidence. I was asked to be a witness on behalf of the defendant in a court case. And how this came about, I was contacted by legal aid department, and I was asked whether I would be willing to provide linguistic advice to the defense team that was defending a particular defendant. Now that defendant, as you'll soon find out, in that defendant's first trial, was found guilty of drug trafficking. And let me explain from the screen. At his trial, on the indictment of unlawful trafficking the drug ice, the defendant, X, was accused by the prosecution of knowingly concealing the drug ice in a game console in his luggage for transporting from Hong Kong to Auckland. Okay, so the first trial, this defendant was found guilty, drug trafficking. In fact, the defendant had pleaded not guilty and denied knowledge of dangerous drugs concealed in the game console, claiming he had been tricked into carrying the drugs. Now, before any of you say, well, how come you are helping out a drug trafficker? First of all, remember that this was at the request of Hong Kong government legal aid department. And it is to provide a fair defense to the defendant. It's part of the judicial process. So in so doing, yes, I was quite willing to take part. One thing that was provided some consolation was when I did talk to the defendant's legal team, they were very convinced of the defendant's that the defendant was not guilty. In fact, what they explained to me was the fact that, in fact, there is sort of a scam that is quite that was taking place quite frequently in Hong Kong, and that was that these crime syndicates would contact elderly people or people from regions that were not that familiar with the ways of the world, and would contact them and tell them that they had won a prize, and the prize was a free trip to Hong Kong. And this they would be put up in a really nice hotel. They would be given their meals, and it looked fantastic. And a number, in fact, have been scammed in this way. A number of elderly people from different places have received this sort of offer not knowing what at all that this has anything to do with drug trafficking, not at all. They think they're receiving a special prize. They come, and then on their way back, they're asked, "Oh, if you don't mind, there's this package. Could you take it and pass it along to a friend? Just do a favor." They have no idea what they're passing along. And in fact, as this defense team, because this defense team had in fact defended a number of those that had been gone through this experience, and the defense team honestly, very sincerely felt that this individual, like these others that they had defended, was indeed not guilty, was innocent, had no idea what this person had been doing. In fact, this person that had been, had very, in fact, very strong religious feelings as well. So that was some consolation to me in then taking part in this. Now, I've yet to explain what my part will be, and I will get to that. All right, so that's a bit of background to this. Now, when the original trial took place, yes, the defendant was found guilty. And the trial was by jury. It was presided over by Deputy High Court Judge, we'll call it High Court Judge Zed. And the defendant, X, was sentenced to 23 years and 9 months imprisonment. Now, the defense team decided to appeal. There's going to be an appeal of this judgment and this sentencing. Now, a few more facts about the defendant. The defendant is a Tongan national, and English is his second language. Now, I don't know if you know where Tonga is. Here, sort of give you an idea. Here's Tonga, all right? As you can see, it's sort of off New Zealand, Australia, like one of these island nations, all right? Tonga. In the original trial, an interpreter was provided to interpret the court proceedings into Tongan for the defendant. The jury, Hong Kong residents, yes, no, as you would expect. And in this case now, after that sentencing, a notice of application for leave to appeal. Okay, you put it forward an application for appeal against the conviction, and this was filed. I'll tell you the outcome. The hearing on this application for appeal not only allowed for the application, the appeal, but at the same time, the judges, the appeal court justices, there are 3 of them, quashed the conviction. They set it aside. The sentence was set aside and a retrial was ordered for this person. Now, that's the outcome. Why? On appeal, why was the appeal, not just the application for appeal, successful? At the application for appeal, the 3 high court justices already made up their minds. They quashed the conviction. They set aside the sentencing and ordered a retrial. How come? What happened? Now let's go back. What were the grounds for the appeal? The appeal called into question whether the judge's summing up. Now, what's that mean, the summing up? That means that if you're going through at the end, more or less toward the end, after all the witnesses have spoken, all the evidence has been presented, and then before the jury goes to make their decision, the judge sums up, gives a summary of all the evidence. The appeal, what the appeal called into question was whether the judge's summing up was adequately translated, arguing that failure to do so denied the defendant a fair trial. So they're asking whether it's a question of the judge's summing up, whether it was adequately translated. Failure to do so, failure to adequately translate the judge's summing up, that part of the trial, that would have denied the defendant a fair trial. The second ground for appeal was that the judge failed to maintain an adequate speed in his summing up. And that was why the interpreter was unable to fully interpret the summing up to the applicant. In other words, the judge spoke too fast. Now, this was where they were asking my advice. My advice they are asking is related to their question whether the judge spoke too fast. Now, what I'm going to be explaining to you today is then what my response was to that and how I responded and the feedback more or less that I gave the defense team. Ground two basically is arguing the judge's summing up exceeded the ability of the trial interpreter to adequately carry out his task. The judge, very simply, spoke too fast. Third ground goes back to the interpreter and the fact that the interpreter was inexperienced, couldn't keep up, mistranslated, failed to translate parts, omitted evidence. Now, is it all the problem of the interpreter? Is it all the interpreter's fault? Or the second ground was that the judge had a role in this as well. All right, so the counsel for the defense, called Mr. Z. Failure of the interpreter to use the appropriate words or to interpret to an extent that fully reflected the answers given by the applicant could have conveyed the impression to the jury that the applicant was unresponsive, incoherent, inconsistent, or even being evasive. And this could have resulted in the jury making adverse findings against the applicant and ultimately influence the outcome of the trial. In other words, if the interpreter is not doing their job and is not interpreting in a way that adequately reflects what's going on, what will come across to the jury is that the defendant maybe is being unresponsive, incoherent, inconsistent. In other words, the fact is, though, that the defendant has been relying on an interpretation that may have been faulty. And so then giving a wrong impression to the jury. When the judges, the appeal court justices, when they did finally conclude and when they did sort of quash this conviction, they did make a statement. And their statement was this: the difficulties lay not with the language, but with the linguist. The difficulties lay not with the language, but with the linguist. This is what they said. Before concluding this judgment, we should emphasize that even though we allow this appeal on grounds 2 and 3, remember, ground 2 was that the judge spoke too fast and the translator couldn't keep up, we do not accept the assertion that the judge spoke at too rapid a pace. No. It was, of course, too rapid for Mr. B, the interpreter, but that was only because Mr. B was not a professional interpreter and lacked the skills needed to provide a simultaneous interpretation. Okay, it's all when they say it's with the linguist, they really mean the interpreter. And they're saying that the interpreter, well, it's the interpreter's problem. It's nothing to do with the fact that the judge spoke at too rapid a pace. Okay, so that's how they responded. Now, let me first give a bit of background. You might be thinking, how is it necessary to have had an interpreter? I mean, after all, the defendant is from Tonga. Yes, Tongan is his first language, but English was his second language. The trial judge, his view was that the defendant, as he said, should not be linguistically disadvantaged by his inability to understand and speak the language of the court. The language of the court. Now remember what we said, field, tenor, mode. What is the language of the court? That is in that context. And so what the judge said was this. This is the trial judge, first trial judge. I am in agreement about the observations concerning his English. I try to take verbatim notes, and at times it was difficult. Not because of the speed, but because of the use of language. I do not think it is something made up by the defense team. In other words, the defense team was asking for an interpreter, and the prosecution was saying he didn't need one. And the trial judge is saying, yes, I agree with the defense team. He should have an interpreter. Finally, the judge said, it's a real difficulty, it's a real risk that if the defendant is not properly expressing himself, he may not be having a fair trial. He may not eventually be regarded as having a fair trial. Okay, so that's the basis for having an interpreter. And in fact, this is a defendant's right to interpreter assistance. It's part of the Hong Kong Bill of Rights. There are certain guarantees that one should be informed promptly and in detail in a language which he understands, the nature and cause of the charge against him. That one should have free assistance of an interpreter if he cannot understand or speak the language in court. And this is also comparable. The provisions of Article 11 are comparable to Article 14, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which applies to Hong Kong by virtue of Article 39 of the Basic Law. Okay, so it's guaranteed. So, the defendant's right to interpreter assistance based on Article 11 2F extends to and encompasses all elements of the trial which affect the defendant's interests. Now, what follows is important. It's not only for the defendant's comprehension. It's not just so that the defendant understands, but more importantly, the defendant has to be able to be a participant in the trial, be able to make decisions on issues of what's going on, cannot be sort of in the dark. And also to be able to give instructions to his legal representative on such issues. Now, you might be saying the interpreter seems to be really at fault here. That's what everyone seems to be saying. Well, let's look at it from the interpreter's point of view. We'll call him Mr. B. He acknowledged that his Tongan was not at the level of a native Tongan speaker in Tonga. He was born in Tonga, but he was raised in Brisbane, Australia. Now, who is Mr. B? Why was he the interpreter? If his Tongan is not that good, and, well, was he a professional? No, he was not. In fact, Mr. B, the interpreter, back up a second. When they were looking at trying to find an interpreter, they had a lot of difficulty. It's very difficult, impossible to find a Tongan interpreter in Hong Kong, at least at that point of the trial in 2019. And it took some time for them to find an interpreter. That meant that not only was the defendant, there in jail waiting for his trial to continue, but also the jury is also being sort of, they're not being let go. what they thought was going to be a rather quick trial turns out to be dragging on. And the jury is also becoming quite agitated, sending really very strongly worded notes to the judge to complain about this, delay. So there's oppression. They need an interpreter. Yes. And they have great difficulty to find one. So it was around the time of the rugby sevens. And the team from New Zealand came, and in the team from New Zealand was a Tongan, Mr. B. He's a rugby player. He's not an interpreter. And so it was put to him, for the sake of this other guy, this defendant, and so that the trial could resume, would you be willing to be the interpreter? Now, Mr. B is very honest about his level of vocabulary in Tongan. He replied he can speak, he can write Tongan language, but there are parts of it, especially the older Tongan language, which he doesn't understand and doesn't speak, and that's more the kind of language that relates to law and stuff like that. He was asked in the appeal, he was also brought as a witness, and he was asked to translate the word DNA into Tongan, and he could not. He was asked to translate the word for suspicion into Tongan. He could not. And so the appeal court justices, they put these questions to Mr. B. They asked him, would it be right to say that if you felt you were not up to the job being an interpreter, you would have said so? Mr. B replied, yes, and the fact that they said that there wasn't anybody else within the country, it was critical for somebody to be able to help to get the court proceedings underway, because there had been, from what I was told, there had been a fair bit of time that he was actually already incarcerated. He's trying to do a good deed. Again, the judges asked, the appeal court justices say, if you felt that, actually, I'm not good enough to do this, you would have said so? Again, he replies, at the start, before I started, yes, I thought I was up for the job. But then obviously at the end of it, there's a lot more to it than I know. And so, ground 3 of the appeal. I want you to note something about what's going on in the courtroom with respect to the interpreter. It is called dockside interpretation. It's simultaneous interpretation. It means that the witness is speaking, or the judge is speaking, or the prosecutor or the defense lawyer, as they're speaking, it is being simultaneously translated to the defendant. Now, the point is that the defendant would have been listening to the interpreter, not to the person speaking. So if there's any fault in terms of the interpretation, if there's gaps, if there's things mistranslated, that does make it is important. You might say, well, doesn't the defendant also speak English? Wouldn't he have also known what was going on? But someone is speaking into your ear the whole time in another language, interpreting what's going on. You're hearing the interpreter. You're not hearing what the others are saying. So whatever is miscommunicated by the interpreter will have an impact on the defendant. What about the courtroom? Now, in the courtroom, the defendant sits in the dock, all right? Now, what's the dock? It is across from the judges. In the dock, there are bars around, and the defendant sits in this, it looks almost like a little prison. There are bars where the defendant is sitting. Now, next to the defendant's dock is a chair for the interpreter. The interpreter is supposed to sit in that chair and be interpreting the whole time what's taking place for the defendant sitting in the defendant's dock. Now, if you are looking at the screen, you'll notice that there is also a mention of an interpreter booth. And as I sat there, this was my first time to be in a courtroom, a Hong Kong courtroom. And as I noticed, there was a nice interpreter booth, and glass encased, looked very modern. And I was thinking, well, that's probably where the interpreter would have sat. Wrong. The interpreter doesn't sit in the interpreter booth. In fact, the interpreter booth has not yet ever been used. Now, it's not just new. It's that when it was built, there was some problem with it that doesn't work right, and some issue about how it was made. So that interpreter booth has sat, never used, never once used. Instead, the interpreter sits in a chair next to the defendant, talking into his ear, telling him what's going on. And the fact the courtroom, the rest of the courtroom can also hear whatever this interpreter is saying. Now, Mr. B, the interpreter, he was asked by the appeal court justices, and I said he's a witness, and he's been called to talk. He said Mr. B was asked to estimate how much of the judge's summing up he was able to exactly interpret. And the interpreter admitted 20 to 30%. At the very end, all right, so the judge is summing up the evidence. The defense is putting all its eggs in this one basket, the summing up. It's not to do so much with the interpretation else, but it really is focusing on the judge's summing up. And he's asked, how much of that summing up could you exactly interpret? And what's the interpreter reply? 20 to 30%. Now, so the appeal is just the first, when the appeal began, the first witness was the interpreter. In fact, the interpreter was, this was before COVID, but still, instead of bringing the Mr. B, who's gone back to, I don't know if it's Australia or New Zealand, and instead of bringing him here, he was being interviewed for the appeal, for this application for the appeal. He was being interviewed via Skype. So he wasn't there, but he was through Skype. You could see him. Now, the appeal court justices, after they heard his testimony, they asked those questions, you heard his responses. This is what the judges, as soon as after his testimony, the judges said, we're going to take a break and we will come back in a moment. So the three high court justices left. When they came back, the justices immediately had come to a conclusion. The justices hearing the appeal, they described as credible and compelling. They concluded this: when an interpreter says that he was only able to interpret 20 to 30% of what had been spoken and was unfamiliar with key words and phrases which were frequently being used in the course of the proceedings, the justices said, we were compelled to conclude that the applicant had not been provided with constitutionally compliant standard of interpretation, one that met the purposes of Article 11(2)(f) rights. Immediately, they proceeded to quash the conviction and the sentence and order a retrial. What was my role? I was asked this question at the very outset, before they were going to have their appeal. The question that the defense team wanted to ask was, what about the speed of delivery? Was it a valid argument to say that the judge spoke too fast? The prosecutor, during the appeal, the prosecutor's argument was this. He said, anyone listening to the recording would conclude that the judge did not speak too quickly. quickly. Rather, he maintained that the judge at the first trial, spoke articulately, clearly, and what he said was easy to comprehend. As the prosecutor is saying, that's basically garbage. The idea that the judge spoke in a way that made it difficult for the interpreter to be able to interpret. Nothing to do with the judge. He spoke clearly, articulately, easy to comprehend. Now, what the defense team is asking was asking me to do a linguistic analysis, to go over the audio recordings of the summing up delivered by this Deputy High Court Judge Zed. The summing up was delivered over 2 days. 25th of April was 70 minutes, a little over an hour. The next day, almost 2 hours. Okay, let me give you something of my analysis. I'm being asked, what about the judge's summing up? How am I going to approach it? How am I going to approach it as a linguist, basically? And what am I going to have to say about the language? All right. I noticed I went through and it's sort of broken up into parts. Opening remarks. The judge directs on some important principles of law, directions of law, the elements of the offense, and then the judge gets into actually summarizing the evidence. On the right-hand side, the last column, you can see the words per minute. 137 words per minute in the opening, and the speed picks up. Now, the very end, you'll notice that it says summary of the evidence, additional 15 minutes. The judge on the first day said that there was a part that he wanted to be sure to get through. So he asked the permission of the jury. Can I hold you over for another 15 minutes and continue and be able then to reach a certain point? Well, I guess the jury agreed, and so he did so, and you'll notice the speed sort of picked up. All right, this is the first day. The second day, it's about 2 hours, and well, you can see again here, I've broken up the summary of evidence into sort of 30-minute intervals, and out of those 30-minute intervals, identified the words per minute, 162, and it picks up speed until we get to around 11:39, and then it's about almost 200 words per minute. Okay, so you have to ask yourself, is that normal? Considering this is sort of the speaking rate, words per minute, we begin to see it starts off 137. It picks up on the first day to 176. On the second day, it starts around 162 and gets up to almost 200. So how does the judges, the way we have to ask this question then is, it's not just reporting that. You have to ask, how does it compare with the normal speaking rate for this situation? For this situation. Okay, let's look at another context then. Let's look at some examples. The 11th Judicial Circuit Court in Illinois estimates the average rate of speech during court proceedings at 150 to 160 words per minute. This is the basis on which a court reporter transcribes 150 to 160. That's the average rate of speed. If for a California court interpreter, their certificate examination, they listen to a 3-minute tape recorded at a speed of 140 words per minute. But you have to keep in mind something else, though. It's not like the court is just like one way of speaking, right? The whole time, because there are different kinds of exchange that take place. You have to look at it from, not just like it's what takes place in the court. That's too general. You know, sometimes the exchanges are extemporaneous, meaning that, like if a witness is being asked questions and they answer, I mean, that's not scripted. But in the case of summing up the evidence, it is scripted. The judge writes it out. It is written all out, and the judge reads it. Now, differences in mode of delivery, whether it's spoken or whether it's written, whether it's scripted or it's free, these are going to have consequences. They're going to have consequences for the form that language takes. So you have to look at it from the situation, and it's not overgeneralized. You have to look at it specifically. What is the mode of delivery? Is it being spoken? Is it extemporaneous, or is it prepared? Is it scripted? That's going to make a difference. In the literature, the comment has been made, speakers reading from a prepared text. I'm sure you've had experience with this. You read from a prepared text, you deliver faster. And when you read, there are none of the pauses, the changes of pace, or repetitions, which normally help to convey meaning, which give spoken language its immediate intelligibility. The way we speak, if I was reading to you now, it would be very different than the way I'm speaking to you now. You read from a prepared text, you deliver faster. And there are none of the sort of pauses, the changes of pace, the repetition that is there in extemporaneous spoken language that are helping us to understand what's being said. Well, there was something else, though, and that was the defendant's counsel. This was the second day of the summing up of evidence. The interpreter told the defense team he's having difficulty keeping up with the judge. So the defense team, the lawyer for the defendant, first thing on the second day, spoke to the judge and said, the interpreter is having difficulty to keep up with you. Can you slow down? Well, you remember what happened, though. On the second day, the judge spoke faster. He's been told in the morning, can you sort of slow your pace so the interpreter can keep up better? And the judge, nevertheless, proceeds to become even faster. Now, what was interesting, remember I mentioned that it got up to 200 words per minute. It actually did get up to 200 words per minute for a period of 6 minutes. Interestingly, what was happening in that 6 minutes? What was that 6 minutes about? Well, it was where the evidence was from the defense team's expert witness related to DNA. So in that part, which was basically helpful to the defense, repeating what was the evidence given by the expert witness for the defense, that's when the judge became the fastest that he was in the whole summing up. That's 6 minutes, 200 words per minute. Remember, the judge is reading from a prepared text. The court interpreter is performing essentially the same task as a translator of a written text, but at a speed of 200 words per minute. I mean, what I want you to follow, you get it, right? The interpreter is listening. He's not reading. He doesn't have the text in front of him. He's only interpreting as the judge reads it aloud. But basically what the judge is reading is a prepared written text. So basically it is no different than a translator of a written text, except, for example, the United Nations stipulates a requirement for translators of a certain number of pages, a certain number of words per day. And basically what is being asked of this interpreter, forget the fact whether he's professional or not, what is being asked of the interpreter is to be able to translate 40 times faster than normal translating work over an extended period of almost up to 2 hours. One writer says this absurd pace quickly reduces the interpreter to a state of mental and physical exhaustion. His usefulness to the listener is practically nil when compared to the service he is able to render when dealing with free speech. And interpreting just free, spontaneous, extemporaneous spoken speech is very different than interpreting for someone who is reading a prepared text at sometimes 200 words per minute over an extended period of time. So the mental and physical exhaustion, the usefulness of the listener to the usefulness of what the interpreter is saying it's nothing. But what is being written here, she is writing about interpreting for international conferences. The point that's being made is for professional interpreters. Again, as I say, forget the fact that this Mr. B was not a trained professional interpreter. Even if you put a trained professional interpreter into that situation, they couldn't keep up. But it's not just a case of speed of delivery. That was sort of, you see, people that have no linguistic background or have no idea what's going on with language, it's how fast, the pace of delivery. But it's more than that. It's also the grammatical complexity. This goes back to something, it's an old study, Charles, 1979. It was an empirical study of the comprehensibility of jury instructions. Jury instructions, just like the summary of evidence. And what they identified were a number of features, linguistic features that cause comprehension problems. What did they identify? First, in an embedded clause, the use of the passive construction. So in the case of the DNA material, and then you have an embedded clause, which is passive voice, found on the wrapping of the lump, there are at least 3 possible points, another embedded clause, another passive voice. Now this is what the trial judge was reading, all right? This is from the actual case. This isn't an example from Charles. Charles identify use of passive constructions. I'm showing you what actually occurred in this case. Charles identify another feature is the combination of many clauses within one sentence. Well, look at this sentence. How many clauses do you have? Finally, the third is what they call with deletion. That is when you have a relative clause and you omit the relative pronoun. Well, you notice that in this example, basically, again, it's a passive voice within an embedded clause, also where the WH word, the relative pronoun, is omitted. Now you have sentences spoken by the trial court judge that all 3 features are there. I've highlighted in red the use of passive voice in subordinate clauses. I've highlighted what's in black, as you can see, the many clauses within the one sentence, and the with deletion is highlighted in blue. But there's more than grammatical complexity. There's something I've been mentioning, lexical density. What is lexical density? What's normal? When you're just talking, typically a clause contains two content lexical words, not grammar words, not like prepositions or anything like that, but content words. Your clauses typically would maybe have two content words per clause. When you get up to written language, then you double that, maybe 4 to 6 content words per clause. In scientific writing, this can go much higher. You remember I talked about there being lexical density because you have a lot of embedded clauses. Halliday points out it can get up to 13. And then when it gets to around 13 or more, the text will become difficult to comprehend. This is an example from the trial court judge's reading of the summation of evidence. 15 content words. You might say, well, you can read it, but they're not reading. The jury's not reading. No one is reading it except the trial court judge who's reading it aloud for 2 hours to listen to that. The interpreter can't keep up. The jury can't keep up. The way the language is working is defeating its purpose. Its purpose is supposed to be getting across to the jury what took place. Is anybody following it? Yeah, I did a study and looked at the sort of the range of the different features that we've identified, the lexical density, and I took just that 6 minutes. Remember that 6 minutes where the judge is talking about the defense teams using their expert witness giving evidence? That's 6 minutes, 200 words per minute. And then look at how many times the lexical density goes higher than, I put 10 as sort of the bar here. Plus add on the number of clauses, plus add on the embedded passages, plus add on the with deletion. Everything that has already been identified in previous studies as creating comprehension problems. Believe me, language is not living up to its purpose. Now, there are ambiguous references as well. I notice I've gone on to 2. It's 10 past 2, and so it probably is overloading to carry on. So I'll take a break here and come back to conclude this after we have had a break. So it's now about 10 past 2. Can we come back around 2:20? All right. Sorry I've gone on longer and not given you a break sooner. We'll take a break now. Okay, we've been looking at what's been going on in this trial, and we've been noticing some things about the way in which language is being used, specifically in terms of what takes place at the end when the judge delivers his summary judgment, summary of the evidence, sorry. We've looked at issues of delivery, speed of delivery, the grammatical complexity, the lexical density. We've noticed that there are quite a few issues about the way that language is used, which would seem to, in many ways, work against the purpose it's supposed to. Last is ambiguous reference. So when we look at ambiguity in terms of the judges speaking, okay, let me just read this example. Mr. N, this is from the judge's summation of evidence. Mr. N mentioned to Officer P that the defendant seemed to have coughed and cleared his throat, exhaled strongly, tapped the table, tapped the telephone, stretched and leaned forward, wiped his eyes, lips, and nose a few times, rubbed or scratched his face, head, and his neck a few times. Now, already you should begin to get a feel for what this reading is like, okay? Very detailed, very detailed. And then the judge continues, these are all things that members of the jury you can see for yourself. Now, when it comes across like that, it sort of would strike you, the jury, as being that not only was it what Mr. N mentioned to Officer P, but that in fact you can see it for yourself. All these things, which would cover what? Well, the coughing, clearing his throat, exhaling, tapping, this and that, stretching, leaning, all these things you can see for yourself, which would seem to confirm that if you, the jury, don't see it, well, why don't you see it? Now that's how it could be interpreted. What the judge could also be meaning here is that you can decide for yourself, but he's not saying that. He's saying you can see for yourself. Again, we have another example. I won't go through this example here, but again, similar thing. When you start to use words like this, and what does this refer to? The judge says, again, this, what was previously mentioned, is recorded on a disc, and it is for you to see for yourself. No, it's not saying you can decide for yourself. It's saying you can see for yourself. So in other words, you should be able to see it. You should be able to know it. It's true. It's accurate. That is how it could be inferred. All right, so let's take a look here. Let's try to sum up some of the things we've been talking about. The field. The judge is delivering summation of evidence. And because what he's talking about will also include specialized legal terms, jargon. The tenor, the judge is reading the summation to the jury. The interpreter is translating for the defendant. The mode, it's a written statement. It is being read aloud by the judge to the jury for over 1 hour on one day and over 2 hours on the second day. These are the demands of the register. This is what is taking place, all right? Given field, tenor, mode. Now some observations. The summation is read aloud for over an hour on the first day. Interrupted, there was a brief break of 42 seconds. And that was when the judge asked to be able to go on for an additional 15 minutes. Otherwise, it's just a constant reading. And nearly 2 hours, interrupted by a break of 20 minutes. The court interpreter was required to mentally process, interpret the judge's summing up into Tongan. Now, Tongan is it has one of the rarest major types of word order, verb initial. The verb comes first. And the court interpreter needed to carry out his task at 40 times the speed of that required by United Nations translators of written documents. Judge Zed read his summation, and as with other written texts, his summary carried a high information load, the high lexical density, compounded not only by a substantial amount of technical legal jargon, but also complex grammatical constructions. It required considerable mental alertness, language proficiency on the part of not just the interpreter, but the jury as well. Add on to this the fact that the summing up was indeed delivered at a rather fast pace. For over an hour, it had to have taxed the mental processing of the court interpreter to such an extent that his performance would have been significantly diminished. So the requirements of the context, the receivers, the jury, and the translator, they're supposed to be familiar with the specialized legal terms? I wonder. You know, the interpreter, because he was inexperienced, he didn't know you could ask the judge to repeat it, to clarify it. He didn't know that. He thought you couldn't interrupt the judge. The summary, as I've said, carried a high information load, substantial amount of technical jargon, complex grammatical constructions. This is because the nature of how it is being delivered. It is read aloud, but in fact is spoken. In fact, it is written down. Now the question, can you say the defendant can be considered to have had a fair trial? Okay, the defense appeal is on the grounds of the summing up. So if the summing up is a problem, the judge reading this summary to the jury, and if it is indeed so problematic, does that sort of call into question the whole trial, the whole judgment? Now the prosecution argued, no, that's the judge's summing up, that's being addressed to the jury. It isn't going to the defendant. Whatever fault there is, whatever deficiency in the interpreting of the summing up for the defendant, it doesn't matter to the jury. They're not interpreted for them, for the defendant. So why is the interpreter issue at all important here? The prosecution recalled a case. They brought up a case where the summing up was not even interpreted to the defendants, no interpretation provided. And the absence of the interpretation didn't make that conviction unsafe. The appeal court justices, they replied counter to the prosecutor. The appeal court justices said that the case that the prosecutor mentioned, what happened in that case was that it wasn't in any way to devalue the importance of summing up or even suggest that the defendant didn't have a right to have the summing up interpreted to him. In fact, what they noted was that the trial judge in that case had given to the counsel prior to his summing up a substantial document which contained all of what he was going to say. In other words, the judge in that case, the case that the prosecutor brought up, the judge gave what he was going to be reading, gave that document to the defense so that they had it, they could be referring to it, they could follow it. Quite a good deal of factual material, anticipating in summary form some aspects of what the recorder would say in greater detail when he came to deal with evidence. So this was a substantial section of the summing up, and this was given beforehand. Certainly, if you had it available to read while the judge is reading, not just listening to someone reading aloud, but able to follow along, that would make a big difference. Okay, now I've mentioned to you, I did all this analysis and so forth. And I was there on the first day. The defense said they might call me to be a witness and to give evidence, the evidence that I've produced regarding what took place. So I was there on the first day of the the application for appeal. And I was sitting there where the witnesses are supposed to be sitting, and the judges, 3 appeal court justices, came out, sat down, and they asked for the defense to indicate what evidence they would be giving for their application for appeal. And so they gave the defense gave what were to be their grounds for appeal. And then the appeal court justices, one of the appeal court justices said this: we can proceed, but we do not want to hear from Professor Webster. I was really rather surprised. I mean, you're at the beginning of it, and to suppose so specifically say, we do not want to hear from Professor Webster. The defense countered to say, well, can that decision be held off until to see whether we do need to call him or not? The point being, they did not want to hear what was being said about the language that is used in the court. The linguistic evidence conclusively explains that not only the interpreter's inability to provide adequate interpretation assistance, but also, I believe, establishes the excessive linguistic demands placed on not just the interpreter, but also the members of the jury. Why is the summation of evidence important? What is its purpose? It is supposed to be a neutral summing up of the facts of the case. Or is it the judge's version of the facts? Notice his increased speed when describing the evidence given by the defense's expert witness. Notice the examples of ambiguous references. You can see it for yourself. So, how can the summation of evidence be improved? Change the mode of delivery. Talking about the summation of evidence. Change the mode of delivery. Do not read it aloud for people to hear, or at least provide the judge's summation in writing for the jury and the interpreter. It's written all out before. Reduce the legal terminology. Simplify the clause structure. Language is not meeting its purpose because the way that we use the language is, in a way, it's defeating the purpose. So that's why I say, do you agree that sometimes the way we use language defeats its intended purpose? The intended purpose is for the jury to be able to receive what were the facts, what took place. But in that summing up of evidence, not only is the interpreter's ability called into question, not just because the interpreter was himself untrained, no. Even if the interpreter were well-trained, professional, the linguistic demands on the interpreter, and I also say the jury also would have been likewise. How could they keep up? So what were they doing for 2 hours? Listening to someone read such detail that not only was so detailed in information, but also so lexically dense, grammatically complex, loaded with technical jargon, and spoken at a pace that was rather fast. This is the point that I'm making here. That when we talk about the effectiveness of language, when we talk about the value of language, how do we value the language in this instance? It wasn't just simply the judge spoke too fast. It wasn't simply that the interpreter was not a professional and untrained. There are other factors here that are going on, and they are related to the language that is being used. So this is, I'd like you to think about this question. You don't have to just focus on this particular example that I'm giving, that I've just been giving to you here. Yeah, but it's out of my experience, and again, the conviction was quashed. A retrial was ordered. Do you know the striking thing is that it is almost 2 years on, and that retrial has yet to take place. So the defendant has been still serving prison time in the meantime, in some measure due to the COVID pandemic. But all along, whether the defendant is innocent, I cannot say. But in a sense, I felt it was to fulfill my duty as a citizen and with a linguistic background to respond to the requests that the legal aid department was making, and to give as good as I can give in terms of explaining. And that's what I feel is the role in terms of us looking at language. We're looking at the value, not only the value to create, be creative, artistic, not only the value to be innovative, language of science, but also just the value of language in everyday life. Linguistics can offer an explanation. Looking at language can offer an explanation. Now, it's about 2:37, and I did want to go on to another subject today in addition, but I'm feeling at this point that I definitely wouldn't get through it in the remaining time. So I'm going to stop here. If you have any questions, if you want to ask me on chat, feel free to do so. I'm going to stop here, and we'll call it a class, and I'll stay online until the end of our class period. So if you do have any questions or comments you want to send via chat, I'd be very happy to hear it. I'm just going to I also did fix the sound. So when we come back next week, we will talk about what's something that always seems to be put off to the end of and be missed out. And that is, I do want to talk about a very interesting study that Halliday did of Darwin's Origin of Species, and what the language reveals about a text that was intended to be science, but in fact becomes art. All right, so that's, and we'll be taking a look at how, again, does our language, our study of language, reveal this to be the case? Can the writing of science become an art? Is it verbal art? Okay, so we'll take a look at that next time. All right, so in the meantime, we'll stop for the day, and I'll see you next week, and I'll hopefully be giving you your test results by next Tuesday. Okay, all right, so we'll say, let me know if you have any questions or not. Does the question I asked for your continuous participation task, I'll reply by speaking, does not relate to what is to follow. Okay, in fact, what I've just been presenting, the court case, I do feel provides a really good example of the way that we use language and the way that language is being used, which really defeats the purpose that it's being used for. So language can be sometimes quite ineffective. And the reasons for its ineffectiveness, again, we can find from the way in which the language is being used, which prompts us to ask then, how could it be used more effectively? So the example, what I will be going on to talk about, looking at Darwin's Origin of Species, does not really relate at all to this question. Any other questions or comments? I put the earphone in. I think I can hear if you want to speak up as well. So it's up to you. If there's anything you'd like to say, any comments, I'd be interested in your views on what I've been talking about. Also, you might say, why did the judges not want to hear? Well, what was explained to me was that they're worried about the floodgates. The floodgates being opened when it becomes apparent that what is at issue and whether or not defendants really have had a fair trial in the sense of being able to, whether the language has accomplished its purpose to provide something which can be comprehended, if that is at all thrown into question. And that's why the judges were so particular to make the point, this has nothing to do with the judge's speaking. It has nothing to do with his pace of delivery. The judges had received the evidence that I had given. The fact that they immediately, from the very beginning, said, we do not want to hear from Professor Webster. In other words, we do not want to hear, what clearly throws into doubt the fact that whether or not the language that is being used actually meets the requirements that are supposed to be providing what is to be provided in what takes place in the courtroom. So, any further questions or any comments? Okay, if there are no questions and no comments, again, I'll stay on in case there's any that come with the chat, but I will turn off my video for the time being, and I will mute myself as well.